August 1945, in the waters off Auckland, New Zealand. A series of controlled explosions sent shockwaves across the Pacific Sea floor. The detonations were precise, calculated, and devastating. Observers on nearby vessels watched as walls of water rose 30 feet high, surging toward the coastline with enough force to obliterate anything in their path. This was not a natural disaster. This was Project SEAL, a deliberate attempt to weaponize the ocean itself. The program had produced results that exceeded all projections. Then, within months, every record vanished from official archives. The Second World War accelerated technological development at an unprecedented pace. Nations poured unlimited resources into research programs that pushed the boundaries of known science. But not all of these programs entered the historical record. Some achieved breakthroughs that were deemed too dangerous, too controversial, or too valuable to share with the public. Their documentation was seized, their facilities dismantled, and their researchers sworn to silence. What follows is an investigation into 10 military research programs that produced tangible results during World War II, then disappeared from history. The evidence suggests these erasures were systematic, not accidental. Project SEAL began in 1944 under the direction of Thomas Leach, a professor at Auckland University. The New Zealand government, at the request of American and British military planners, authorized experiments in underwater explosives designed to create artificial tsunamis. The concept was straightforward. Detonate precisely calibrated charges at specific ocean depths to generate destructive wave patterns. Early tests in Wangaparaoa Peninsula demonstrated the principle worked. By adjusting the placement and timing of explosives, researchers could direct wave energy toward predetermined targets. The potential military application was obvious. Coastal cities, naval installations, and invasion fleets could be destroyed without deploying conventional forces. Between January and August 1945, Project SEAL conducted 3,700 test explosions. The data collected was extensive: wave heights, propagation patterns, coastal impact assessments, optimal charge configurations. Military observers from Washington and London reviewed the findings with considerable interest. One memorandum, declassified decades later, described the results as exceeding expectations and recommended immediate operational deployment. Plans were drafted for using tsunami weapons against Japanese-held Pacific islands. The invasion of the Japanese mainland, if necessary, would potentially incorporate tsunami strikes against coastal defenses. Then the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended. Project SEAL was abruptly terminated. What happened to the research? Official records indicate the project was simply discontinued as no longer necessary, but documents later revealed suggest a more complex ending. Thomas Leach's complete research data, including all experimental results and theoretical calculations, was confiscated by American military intelligence. The New Zealand government received no copies. Leach himself was prohibited from publishing any findings or discussing the work publicly. When he attempted to present a paper on underwater explosives at a scientific conference in 1946, he was denied permission. His notes from the project were never returned. Decades later, partial declassification released only summary documents, not the technical specifications that would allow replication. The actual methodology for creating weaponized tsunamis remains classified. Why would tsunami research require permanent secrecy after the war ended? What happened to Leach's calculations? Why were his detailed experimental results never released even 60 years later? Across the Pacific, another unconventional weapons program was producing remarkable results. Project Pigeon, initiated by behavioral psychologist B.F. Skinner in 1943 trained pigeons to guide missiles toward their targets. The concept sounds absurd until you examine the success rate. Skinner discovered that pigeons could be conditioned to recognize specific visual target ships, buildings, military installations, and PEC at corresponding points on a screen. These PECs could be converted into electrical signals that adjusted a missile's flight path. The system worked. In controlled tests, pigeon-guided missiles achieved accuracy rates exceeding 70%, far superior to the primitive electronic guidance systems available in 1943. The military initially dismissed the project as impractical, but Skinner persisted, refining the training protocols and demonstrating increasingly precise results. By 1944, Project Pigeon had evolved into Project Orkin with expanded funding and military oversight. The Pigeons proved remarkably reliable. They could distinguish between different types of naval vessels, identify camouflage targets, and maintain focus even under simulated combat conditions. Wind, vibration, and noise did not significantly degrade their performance. Technical reports from the program documented successful guidance of missile prototypes using live pigeons in over 200 test flights. The accuracy was consistent and reproducible. Military planners began discussing operational deployment against German and Japanese targets. Then the project was canceled in October 1944. The official explanation cited the development of electronic guidance systems that would eventually surpass biological methods. But electronic guidance in 1944 was primitive and unreliable. Radar-guided missiles frequently missed their targets. The German V-1 flying bombs, using gyroscopic guidance, were notoriously inaccurate. Skinner's pigeons demonstrably outperformed available alternatives. So why terminate a program that worked? Documents that might answer this question were classified. Skinner's complete experimental data, the training protocols, the conditioning techniques, the detailed performance metrics disappeared into military archives. When Skinner tried to publish his findings in scientific journals, sections were redacted. The specific methods for conditioning animals to perform complex target recognition tasks were removed. Decades later, some material was declassified, but key sections remained withheld. What aspects of animal behavior control required permanent secrecy? In the final months of the war, Allied forces advancing through Germany discovered weapons research facilities that defied conventional understanding. Among the most disturbing was acoustic weapons development at Lofer, Austria. German scientists had been experimenting with focused sound waves as a means of disabling enemy soldiers and equipment. The principle was based on resonance frequencies. Every object has a natural frequency at which it vibrates most intensely. If you could generate sound at precisely that frequency with sufficient amplitude, you could shatter the object or render it inoperative. Early experiments focused on disrupting enemy communications equipment and inducing nausea in soldiers. By 1944, the research had progressed to prototype weapons capable of more severe effects. The Schallkanon, or sound cannon, utilized parabolic reflectors to concentrate acoustic energy into a narrow beam. Test reports documented effects on animals placed at varying distances from the device. At close range, the acoustic pressure was lethal. At medium range, it caused severe disorientation, internal hemorrhaging, and permanent hearing damage. At longer ranges, it induced intense nausea and loss of motor control. The weapon was not science fiction, it was operational. Allied intelligence officers who inspected the facility in May 1945 found detailed logs of test firings, engineering specifications, and plans for mass production. Some reports mention testing on prisoners, though documentation of these experiments was largely destroyed before Allied arrival. What happened to this research? The acoustic weapon facility at Lofer was seized by American forces. All equipment, documents, and prototypes were removed and transported to the United States. The German scientists involved were not prosecuted for war crimes. Instead, several were quietly recruited under Operation Paperclip, the program that brought Nazi scientists to America to continue their research. Where did the sound cannon technology go? No American acoustic weapon program was ever publicly acknowledged. Yet decades later, patents appeared for acoustic crowd control devices, ultrasonic incapacitators, and directed energy weapons that bore striking resemblance to the principles documented at Lofer. The direct line of development from Nazi acoustic weapons to modern sonic devices is never officially acknowledged. The original German research data remains classified. Why would 70-year-old acoustic research require ongoing secrecy? What applications were deemed too sensitive to reveal? Beneath the waves, another breakthrough was being systematically erased from history. Japan's I-400 class submarines represented a radical advancement in naval engineering. These vessels were the largest submarines built during World War II, measuring over 400 feet long and capable of traveling around the world without refueling. But their most remarkable feature was concealed within, a pressurized hangar that could store and launch 3 attack aircraft. The submarines could surface, deploy their aircraft, and submerge again within minutes. This capability rendered aircraft carriers partially obsolete and introduced entirely new tactical possibilities. The I-400 program was not theoretical. 3 submarines were completed and operational by 1945. They conducted successful test missions, demonstrating their ability to remain undetected while crossing vast ocean distances and launching surprise air attacks. Plans existed for using these submarines to strike the Panama Canal, American coastal cities, and strategic targets across the Pacific. The Japanese Navy had solved complex engineering challenges: how to pressurize an aircraft hangar within a submarine hull, how to rapidly deploy and recover aircraft at sea, how to maintain mechanical reliability during extended submergence. These were genuine innovations that changed naval warfare possibilities. When Japan surrendered, American forces seized all 3 I-400 submarines. Naval intelligence officers conducted extensive inspections, documenting every technical detail. The submarines were brought to Hawaii for further study. Engineers disassembled systems, photographed components, and interviewed captured Japanese crew members. Then, in 1946, all 3 submarines were deliberately sunk off the coast of Oahu, not scrapped, not preserved, sunk in deep water where recovery would be extremely difficult. The official explanation was that the submarines had no further value, but this explanation contradicts the intensive study that preceded their destruction. Why study something extensively, then deliberately make it inaccessible? Why not preserve at least one submarine for ongoing research or museum display? The answer emerged decades later through Soviet archives. Soviet intelligence had been demanding access to the captured I-400 submarines as part of post-war technology sharing agreements. American officials were preparing to allow Soviet inspectors to examine the vessels rather than share the technology. The submarines were destroyed, but their technical specifications had already been extracted. American submarine development in the following decades incorporated design features remarkably similar to I-400 innovations: increased hull size, specialized equipment compartments, enhanced diving capabilities. The connection was never officially acknowledged. The complete engineering documentation from the I-400 program remains classified. Why would submarine designs from 1945 still require secrecy? What capabilities were considered too dangerous to share, even with allies? While navies fought beneath the waves, researchers in Britain were making breakthroughs in infrared detection technology. The Proximity Fuse project, based at RAF Deford, developed systems for detecting aircraft and vehicles in complete darkness. The technology worked on a principle called passive infrared sensing, detecting heat signatures emitted by engines, exhausts, and warm bodies without requiring active illumination. By 1944, British researchers had created handheld devices capable of detecting aircraft at ranges exceeding 3 miles and ground vehicles at over 1 mile. These devices gave Allied forces a decisive advantage in night operations. German forces could not understand how British guns tracked targets in absolute darkness. The infrared detection program produced over 200 prototype units. Field reports documented successful target acquisition in conditions where visual identification was impossible. The technology allowed anti-aircraft guns to engage enemy bombers before searchlights could be activated, eliminating the warning that illumination provided. It enabled night fighters to intercept raiders without using radar, which could be detected and jammed. Ground forces used infrared detectors to identify enemy positions and movements during darkness. The devices were reliable, portable, and devastatingly effective. Production was being scaled up for widespread deployment when the war in Europe ended. What happened to this technology? After May 1945, the infrared detection program was immediately classified. All prototype units were recalled and secured in military storage. Production facilities were dismantled. The research scientists were reassigned to other projects and prohibited from discussing their work. British military officials cited concerns about Soviet acquisition of the technology as justification for secrecy, but this reasoning seems insufficient. Infrared detection was a defensive technology, useful for protecting territory, not invading it. Why would defensive capability require such extreme classification? Why were even Allied nations denied access to the research? Declassified documents from the 1990s suggest additional motives. British infrared detection technology had revealed an unexpected capability, detecting humans at substantial distances based on their body heat alone. This had obvious applications beyond military defense. Surveillance, tracking, population monitoring, border control law became possible with passive infrared detection that required no visible equipment and left no trace. The technology could observe without being observed. This capability was deemed too sensitive for public knowledge. The research was buried, then quietly resurrected decades later in intelligence and security applications. Modern thermal imaging owes its existence to World War II British research that was officially discontinued. The direct connection is rarely acknowledged. The original wartime documentation, including the full capabilities of those early devices, remains partially classified. What did those prototypes detect that modern explanations avoid discussing? In the chaos of the Eastern Front, Soviet researchers were conducting materials science experiments that produced anomalous results. The T-34 tank program, based in Kharkov before the German invasion and later relocated to the Urals, had been tasked with developing improved armor protection. Standard armor steel was vulnerable to German anti-tank weapons. Soviet metallurgists experimented with alloying elements, heat treatment processes, and structural modifications to increase penetration resistance. One particular formula, designated Alloy 43, demonstrated properties that exceeded theoretical predictions. Test results documented penetration resistance far beyond what standard metallurgical theory suggested was possible. Armor-piercing shells that should have penetrated the test plates instead deflected or shattered. The armor remained lighter than conventional thick plate, suggesting the resistance came from material properties, not simply mass. Soviet engineers could not fully explain the results. The alloying composition was documented. The heat treatment process was recorded, but the mechanism that produced such exceptional performance remained unclear. Several batches of Alloy 43 were produced and fitted to experimental T-34 variants. Combat reports from units equipped with these vehicles noted unusual survivability in engagements where standard T-34s were destroyed. After the war, Alloy 43 disappeared from Soviet tank production. The formula was classified and archived. No explanation for discontinuation appeared in metallurgical literature. When Soviet archives partially opened in the 1990s, researchers searching for wartime materials data found that files related to Alloy 43 had been removed. The technical specifications, test results, and production records were not declassified with other materials from the period. Former Soviet metallurgists, when interviewed, claimed the formula produced inconsistent results or that the performance advantages were exaggerated. But combat reports contradict these dismissals. Something about Alloy 43 made Soviet authorities decide it should not be used or studied further. What was the problem? One hypothesis involves radioactive contamination. Some alloys experimented with during the war period incorporated materials from questionable sources. Scrap metal, recycled components, captured enemy equipment all were melted down and reformulated. If Alloy 43 inadvertently incorporated radioactive elements that enhanced certain material properties, this would explain both its unusual performance and its subsequent suppression. Armor that protects crews while slowly poisoning them is not a sustainable solution, but this is speculation. The actual composition of Alloy 43 remains classified in Russian military archives. Why would a tank armor formula from 1943 still require secrecy? What did it contain that cannot be publicly acknowledged? The Pacific Theater saw another unconventional weapons program that achieved operational success before vanishing from official history. Project X-ray, initiated by the United States in 1942, weaponized a common mammal, the Mexican free-tailed bat. Dental surgeon Lytle Adams proposed the concept to the military after observing the vast bat colonies in New Mexico. His idea was simple but devastating. Attach small incendiary devices to bats, release them over Japanese cities at dawn, and let the bats roost in the wooden structures that comprised most Japanese buildings. At a predetermined time, the incendiary devices would ignite, starting thousands of simultaneous fires across the target area. The military approved the concept and began extensive testing. Researchers captured bats, designed miniature napalm devices weighing less than an ounce, and developed methods for attaching them without harming the bats or preventing flight. Early tests at Carlsbad Army Airfield in New Mexico demonstrated the bats would indeed seek shelter in buildings. A more ambitious test at WWII Proving Ground in Utah involved releasing bats over a mock Japanese village constructed for the purpose. The bats dispersed as predicted, entering structures through every available opening. When the incendiaries ignited, the entire village was consumed by fire within minutes. The test exceeded all expectations. Project X-Ray progressed to operational planning. Millions of bats were to be released from bombers in specially designed containers that would open at altitude, allowing the bats to disperse naturally. Each bomber could carry containers holding thousands of bats, multiplying the destructive potential of conventional incendiary raids. The psychological impact of seemingly spontaneous fires, starting simultaneously across an entire city, was considered an additional benefit. Plans were drawn for deployment against Tokyo, Osaka, and other major Japanese population centers. Production began on incendiary devices and deployment containers. Then the project was abruptly canceled in 1944. The stated reason was resource allocation. The atomic bomb program required precedence, and bat-based weapons seemed unnecessary once nuclear weapons became available. But this timing raises questions. Project X-Ray was canceled months before the first successful atomic bomb test. How could military planners know nuclear weapons would work when deciding to terminate an operational, conventional weapon? Additionally, the complete documentation of Project X-Ray was classified far beyond what canceled programs typically received. The training manuals, the incendiary device specifications, the bat handling procedures all were secured and removed from military archives. When researchers tried to study the program decades later, they found gaps in the documentation. Sections were missing. Technical details had been redacted even in declassified materials. Why such thorough suppression of a bat bomb program? One possibility involves international law. The use of animals as weapons raised questions about existing treaties regarding permissible military conduct. If Project X-Ray had been deployed and its nature became known, it might have established precedent for biological warfare claims that could complicate American legal positions. Better to classify the entire program and deny its operational readiness. But this explanation doesn't account for the continuing classification of technical details. Why remain secretive about bat handling methods and incendiary attachment procedures 70 years later? What aspects of the program remain sensitive enough to withhold from historical record? While animals were being weaponized in the Pacific, a different kind of weapon was being developed in laboratories across the Allied nations. Truth serums, multiple programs operating under various code names in Britain, America, and Canada, experimented with drugs that could lower psychological resistance and compel subjects to reveal information. The primary substance investigated was scopolamine, derived from plants in the nightshade family. In specific doses, scopolamine induced a state where subjects became highly suggestible and less capable of maintaining deliberate deception. Intelligence agencies saw immediate applications for interrogating prisoners of war and enemy agents. British research conducted at Porton Down Under, the designation intelligence research, produced the most extensive documentation. Trials on volunteer soldiers demonstrated that scopolamine combined with barbiturates could significantly increase the likelihood of subjects revealing concealed information. The drugs did not force truth in the absolute sense as subjects could still lie, and sometimes confabulated false information, but they reduced the mental effort required for interrogation and increased the rate of genuine disclosures. Intelligence officers using the technique reported success rates far exceeding standard interrogation methods. The drugs were used operationally on captured enemy personnel beginning in 1943. After the war, these programs were not discontinued. They expanded. The techniques developed during wartime interrogations became the foundation for classified programs like MKULTRA in the United States and similar operations in Britain and Canada, but the direct connection to World War II research is rarely emphasized. Official histories describe post-war mind control programs as new initiatives, not continuations of wartime work. Why the disconnect? Examining what is documented versus what is redacted provides clues. Declassified World War II truth serum files focus on drug administration procedures and success rates. Redacted sections involve detailed transcripts of actual interrogations and the specific information extracted. These omissions suggest that wartime interrogations revealed intelligence so sensitive or obtained through methods so controversial that they cannot be disclosed, even 70 years later. What questions were asked? What did prisoners reveal? If standard military intelligence was obtained, there would be little reason for permanent classification. The redactions suggest something more problematic, perhaps admissions of war crimes that implicate Allied as well as Axis powers. Perhaps intelligence about post-war operations that remains sensitive. Perhaps evidence that the drug interrogations extracted unreliable information that led to unjust prosecutions. The truth serum programs achieved their stated goal of reducing interrogation resistance, but what that revealed became a liability requiring permanent suppression. The final months of the war saw frantic German attempts to deploy weapons that might reverse their deteriorating position. Among the most bizarre was research into coal dust explosions as a military weapon. German chemists had discovered that coal dust, when dispersed in specific concentrations and ignited, produced explosions of extraordinary violence. The physics were well understood. Increasing the surface area of combustible material by grinding it into fine particles dramatically accelerated burn rates. But weaponizing this principle required solving complex problems of particle size distribution, atmospheric dispersal, and ignition timing. By early 1945, German researchers at facilities in the Harz Mountains had developed prototype devices capable of creating coal dust explosions in open air. The weapons were not incendiary bombs in the conventional sense. They dispersed an aerosol cloud of ultrafine coal particles, then ignited the cloud after optimal dispersion. The resulting explosion produced overpressure waves comparable to high explosives but required far less sophisticated materials. Coal, a substance Germany had in abundance, became a potential explosive filler for weapons when processed correctly. Test detonations demonstrated that coal dust explosions could destroy structures, disable vehicles, and incapacitate personnel across areas exceeding 100 meters radius. Allied forces discovered the coal dust research facility in April 1945. American engineers examined the test site, reviewed the German documentation, and conducted their own assessment of the weapon's potential. Their reports acknowledged the concept was viable and could be scaled for strategic applications. Then the facility was demolished. Not merely abandoned or secured, deliberately destroyed, the documentation was confiscated and classified. German scientists involved in the program were interrogated, then released without further oversight. No war crimes charges, no recruitment into American programs, just questioning, then silence. What happened to coal dust explosive research? No American or British weapons program using this principle ever appeared in military arsenals, yet the principle was sound. Industrial accidents involving grain silos, coal mines, and flour mills had demonstrated the explosive potential of dispersed combustible dusts for over a century. Deliberately weaponizing this was merely engineering application of known physics. Why didn't Allied militaries pursue it? One explanation involves strategic resources. Coal dust weapons required large quantities of finely processed coal. This processing consumed energy and industrial capacity. More conventional explosives were more efficient to produce, but this reasoning doesn't explain the thorough suppression of the German research. If the weapons were impractical, why classify the documentation? Why demolish the test facility? A darker possibility involves civilian applications. Coal dust explosions were already a known hazard in mining operations. If detailed research existed documenting optimal particle sizes, dispersion methods, and ignition timing for maximizing explosive yield, this information could enable industrial sabotage or terrorism. A saboteur with access to coal processing facilities could potentially cause catastrophic explosions using the German weaponization research. By classifying and suppressing this information, authorities prevented its misuse. But this assumes the threat remains relevant 70 years later. Modern explosive materials are far more accessible than processed coal dust. Why maintain classification? What aspect of coal dust explosive research remains too dangerous to acknowledge? These 10 programs share a pattern. Each achieved documented success during World War II. Each had funding, facilities, and verifiable results. Each vanished from historical record through systematic suppression. The technologies were not failures that simply faded from relevance. They worked. They demonstrated capabilities that posed questions about conventional understanding of warfare, physics, and human cognition. Then they were erased. Consider what these programs represented: weaponized natural forces, biological guidance systems, acoustic pressure weapons, advanced naval engineering, infrared detection, anomalous materials, animal vectors, pharmaceutical interrogation, and explosive chemistry. Each challenged existing military doctrine. Each offered capabilities that authorities decided should not become public knowledge. The suppression was not random. It followed a logic. Technologies that could be easily replicated by adversaries were classified. Technologies that raised ethical or legal complications were buried. Technologies that suggested capabilities beyond official scientific consensus were denied. But suppression requires more than classification. It requires removing people. Thomas Leach, the tsunami bomb researcher, never published again in his field, BF. Skinner wrote extensively but never detailed the complete pigeon guidance protocols. British infrared researchers moved to other projects without explanation. Soviet metallurgists who knew alloy 43's composition vanished during Stalin's purges or remained silent afterward. German acoustic weapon scientists disappeared into American black programs or died in the immediate post-war period. The human knowledge was eliminated alongside the documentary evidence. What was at stake? These programs demonstrated that the boundaries of possible warfare were wider than publicly acknowledged. If tsunami weapons could destroy coastal cities, if infrared detection could track humans invisibly, if animals could be controlled as precision weapons, then the nature of conflict had changed in ways that military establishments chose not to reveal. Public knowledge of these capabilities might spark arms races in exotic weapons. International treaties might need renegotiation. Citizens might question whether their governments were protecting them or exposing them to new categories of threat. The pattern extends beyond World War II. Technologies developed during wartime frequently disappear before reappearing decades later in civilian or military applications, their origins obscured. Modern acoustic crowd control devices trace lineage to German sound cannons. Thermal imaging systems evolved from British infrared research. Drone guidance systems incorporate principles tested with pigeons. The knowledge wasn't destroyed, it was sequestered, studied in classified facilities, and selectively deployed when authorities decided the time was appropriate. This raises uncomfortable questions about scientific progress and historical transparency. How many other breakthroughs were achieved and hidden? How many researchers were silenced? What technologies exist now in classified programs that will not be revealed for decades? The 10 programs examined here became known only through partial declassification, often released under pressure from Freedom of Information requests or after researchers died. What remains classified? What will never be released? Consider the implications for technological development. Science supposedly advances through open publication, peer review, and collaborative research. But classified military programs operate outside this system. Breakthroughs made in secret cannot be built upon by the wider scientific community. Parallel research wastes resources, rediscovering what classified programs already know. The suppression of wartime innovations delayed technological progress that might have benefited humanity. How much faster would infrared sensing have developed if British research had been published in 1946? What civilian applications of acoustic focusing might have emerged from German sound weapon data? What medical advances might have come from openly studying scopolamine's neurological effects? The counterargument, of course, is that some knowledge is too dangerous for open publication. The atomic bomb became the paradigm of necessarily secret research. But the 10 programs examined here were not atomic weapons. They were refinements of existing principles, applications of known science, or discoveries of anomalous effects. Their suppression suggests a broader philosophy. Any military advantage, no matter how small, justifies classification. Any technology that poses questions about official capabilities must be hidden. This philosophy assumes government authorities are better positioned than scientists or citizens to judge what should be known. It assumes secrecy serves national interest more than transparency. It assumes the benefits of suppressed knowledge outweigh the costs. But who makes these decisions? By what criteria? The classification system operates in shadow, accountable only to itself. Documents remain secret not because they're dangerous, but because someone decades ago decided they should be secret, and the bureaucratic inertia of classification persists. The 10 programs described here represent a fraction of what was hidden. They became partially known through circumstance, through declassification, through researchers who broke silence late in life. How many others remained completely buried? How many weapons were tested and dismissed? How many scientific phenomena were observed and suppressed? How many inventors had their work seized and classified? The historical record is incomplete by design. What should we conclude from this investigation? That military secrecy serves necessary functions but extracts costs that are rarely calculated. That technological progress happens in parallel, tracks one open, one hidden, and the hidden track influences the visible one in unacknowledged ways. That researchers who made genuine breakthroughs sometimes had their achievements stolen by classification, dying without recognition. That the boundaries of possible technology are deliberately obscured to maintain strategic advantages that may be illusory. That historical narratives are constructed through omission as much as inclusion. The erosion of these secrets happens slowly. Researchers die, documents decay, classification systems lose track of what they're protecting. Eventually, fragments emerge. A memo here, a photograph there, testimony from elderly veterans who decide silence no longer matters. By assembling these fragments, we can reconstruct what was hidden, not completely, not with certainty, but enough to understand that the official history of World War II technology is incomplete. Enough to know that breakthroughs occurred that authorities decided the world should not learn about. Enough to ask what else remains concealed. If these 10 programs intrigue you, consider subscribing to Investigator Squirrel. More classified research exists than what was examined here. More inventors were silenced. More breakthroughs were buried. The process of uncovering suppressed history continues. What other World War II programs produced results that were erased? What Cold War research achieved breakthroughs that remain classified? What modern black programs are developing technologies we won't learn about for decades? Share your theories in the comments below. The investigation continues.